Hey, what's up y'all? I am all dressed and ready for school. I'm gonna do a presentation today in my program about some of the research that I've been doing. So I haven't done anything to my hair all week and I figured I would just, control it a little bit, just a little bit. I want something that will get me through like the middle of next week, so just like 4 or 5 days. So I kind of have a general style in the back of my mind, but always when updos happen, they're like a free-for-all. So we'll see what happens. And make sure that you subscribe on my channel. I know I haven't been doing a lot of like styling tutorials. I've been doing a lot of product reviews, but if you want to see more hairstyle tutorials, please let me know and like this video for more of those kinds of videos. That was redundant. Okay, I'm gonna start by putting some moisture back in my hair. This is just water. All right, so my dissertation is on the history of asthma in African Americans, and I'm like kind of finally at the point where I'm done with classes. I'm like halfway done with exams, so I can kind of get really into my research. And what I've been researching for the past couple of months is the emergence of asthma during the civil rights movement. So during like the 1950s and 1960s, because at that time there were two pretty big studies that showed that there were huge rates of asthma, like 200 people a day going to the hospital complaining of asthma in New Orleans and in New York. So, and this kind of emerged in like 63, 64, 65. So I'm kind of interested, like how did asthma all of a sudden become a big deal in the 1960s, and how did doctors think about asthma along racial terms? And for some context, asthma doesn't have one cause. It is more prevalent in African American and Puerto Ricans. Some people think it's genetic, some people think it's environmental, some people think it's an issue of socioeconomic status, housing, all these potential causes. I'm more interested in how the different ways that doctors think about asthma's causes are either created socially, so a product of their social time, or the way that doctors think about asthma has effects on people who have asthma in some kind of a way. So that's kind of like what I'm interested in. Okay, so first thing I'm gonna do is part my hair on a bias from one ear or one side to the other. And this doesn't have to be super neat. I'm gonna clean it up later. Yeah, so for some background, asthma in like the 1900s, doctors thought that Black people couldn't have asthma because they thought of asthma as a civilized disease, and because Black people weren't civilized, obviously, then they couldn't have asthma. So that's kind of like the backdrop that I'm framing all this research in. So I'm just curious as to how in 60 years it went from, oh, Black people couldn't have asthma, to actually Black people have asthma at rates 2 to 3 times higher than white people. Like, how did that happen? So back to the civil rights movement. In New Orleans and New York, there were several studies done to try to figure out what was causing certain hospitals that were predominantly used by Black people, like New Orleans Charity Hospital or New York's Harlem Hospital, like what was causing high rates of asthma hospitalizations in these places, like in the fall months. So like in November, in September, like what was causing 200 people to go to the hospital in a span of 24 hours in these cities. So what I noticed was that in the 1960s, like when these asthma research studies came out, the causes that they were kind of focusing on, garbage dumps and like smoke that was being emitted from garbage dump fires, or potential housing issues, like those are really, really popular at that time. And so I'm arguing that that kind of medical research actually helped to bolster civil rights calls for better housing, better living environments, less segregation, less job discrimination, and just overall racial equality. So the asthma research at that time kind of provided validity for Black social calls for equality in a way that, perhaps without these studies that demonstrated that there were actually large differences in Black people's state of living in America. They played some role in helping to advance the rights of people of color in this country. And that's because these asthma studies, they reached national attention. So it wasn't just New Orleans newspapers talking about the asthma outbreak. It was in Chicago Defender, the Washington Post, the Times Herald, the LA Times. What was Philadelphia's paper? I forgot Philadelphia's paper, but like all of these newspapers were talking about this one issue. So it was definitely something that the nation had brought attention to. In other cities by 1960, I believe, 10 cities had noticed that in the fall months, in September, October, November, there were huge rates. There was a spike in asthma hospitalizations in the hospitals in the city that served predominantly Black patients. And this was in a time where, you know, hospitals were supposed to be desegregated, but still, based on where people lived, you know, that would often determine what hospital you went to. So a lot of these hospitals rarely served the Black community. They were public hospitals, they were charity hospitals, they were hospitals where you didn't need insurance. So these were the kinds of places that would end up having hundreds of people coming in one day complaining of asthma. So it's crazy. At the same time, like, civil rights is happening, like protests are happening, riots are happening, and so you have in this you have the very lived reality of people who cannot breathe because of their asthma, at the same time as you have a stifling of equal opportunity that people were fighting for. In New Orleans, just a few days after a really big asthma outbreak that killed 3 people, Ruby Bridges integrated William Frantz Elementary School, and there was rioting for days and days. In New York, you know, in the same year that this really big study came out comparing the rates of asthma hospitalizations in Harlem, Spanish Harlem, and in Brooklyn, you know, just a few weeks later, the Harlem riots in 1964 happened, where people were rioting the killing of a 15-year-old Black boy by an off-duty white police officer. So, you know, these asthma studies were coming out at a time of very intense racial tensions, civil rights tensions, like at the height of the civil rights era. So as all these riots are happening, scientists start thinking about a different possible explanation for the high rates of asthma. Rather than thinking about the effects of air pollution or segregation and housing in these communities, all of a sudden the explanation turns to civil rights itself. So scientists hypothesize, well, maybe it's the emotional frustration that is a part of the civil rights movement. So people feeling disenfranchised, people feeling like they're being treated unfairly, that kind of emotional distress. Well, maybe it's that's causing asthma. Maybe it's the you know, maybe it doesn't have anything to do with housing. Maybe it's just like anger boiled up that's causing asthma. So that becomes like the prevalent cause theory for asthma in around 65 and 66. So no longer are we thinking about the environment, whether it's indoor or outdoor. No longer are we thinking about air pollution and smog and dust. You know, now we're thinking about, well, it's just because people are angry. That's why they're wheezing and they're unable to breathe. It's because they're angry. And so it kind of removes the blame. I'm arguing that, you know, this theory of asthma as a result of civil rights tension kind of puts the blame of asthma back onto the individual. No longer are we going to hold landlords accountable for improving their apartments so that there aren't roaches and rats running around, fix the windows so that there isn't cold air coming in. We're not going to hold those people accountable anymore. Instead, we're going to blame Black people themselves for having asthma because they are affected so deeply by the civil rights movement. And I kind of see this as a complete undermining of the work that asthma helped to do to bring attention to issues of housing and such, by taking the attention away from what we call social determinants of health and placing the blame on something innate and emotional. It kind of like reversed all the great work that this research had done to bring light to racial inequality. I see this as being very important for today's world, because today, you know, asthma is still a huge issue in Black communities, and people know that, you know, if you live in public housing, you're more susceptible to asthma. You're more likely to have asthma. If you live in an urban neighborhood, you're more likely to have asthma. If you are below the poverty line, you're more likely to have asthma. And so, you know, these things that would seem so simple as the way to address the asthma disparity, improve housing, improve wages so that people aren't living below the poverty line, like address racial discrimination and segregation, both inside the healthcare system and outside of the healthcare system. Like those things would be so, I mean, they're not easy to do, but that's really where the issue lies. But rather than doing that, you know, all of a sudden, since the mid-2000s, now what we're really concerned about is genetics. So finding like a gene for asthma. What's the asthma gene? And I find this really problematic because it is kind of like a reversal back to the civil rights emotional explanation. So if we can find a gene for asthma, if we can tie it to something that is not caused socially, then all of a sudden it removes all of the blame and responsibility from either the government or, you know, someone else, and puts the blame back on the individual, which isn't helpful. We've known since the 1960s that poor housing is what causes asthma, you know? So like, why all of a sudden are we really curious about genetic explanations? Like, there isn't a gene, and by looking at a gene, we're saying that there are different genes in different races, which is complete nonsense. Like, we addressed that years and years ago. Like, there are no differences, there are no innate differences between races. Like, people are 99% more similar than they are different. So like, why are we still trying to like find these differences in like people of color? Ugh, that's like a whole nother thing. So I'm kind of arguing that asthma can be seen as being emblematic of this issue that we have in healthcare today, where there's a shift away from focusing on the fundamental causes of disease, the structural causes of disease, and trying to find biomedical explanations for disease and illness. So that's like my whole theory. And this is also the front of my hair. I'm gonna redo this part. So yeah, it's kind of heavy for, you know, a YouTube tutorial, but now you know, all right? I'm gonna do something with the back. Maybe I'll flat twist it, maybe I'll 2-strand twist it, but I will come back and show y'all. So it's about age control. So I definitely got a little lazy in the back, and I feel like I could have done a few more twists in the back, but whatever. So did I finish? I think I finished telling like my whole presentation pretty much in the span of this video. If you like this hairstyle, definitely a thumbs up and subscribe if you aren't subscribed yet and you want to see more hairstyles. I used to do a lot of flat twist updo tutorials, like, I don't know, like 3 years ago, like way back in the day, man. It feels so long ago. But I kind of fell off, and I think that like affected my hair. But like now we're kind of like getting there again, so I'm liking it, I'm liking it. This really could use some hoops, but I don't have any on me right now, alas. Here is my little look for my presentation today. I hope that you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. I just finished my 3rd year of my PhD program, and some people have reached out to me over the course of the couple of years that I've been in the program, kind of asking me for tips about how to apply, you know, when is the best time to email professors, how do I construct my personal statement. So I figured I would just combine all of those.